So today we're going to talk about starting native perennials from seed, a number of relatively easy to start native species. I apologize, since I forgot to start the recording, I'm going to go back and to the beginning of this slide and just say that our native species are adapted to the 4-season New England climate because plant seeds have mechanisms to prevent them from germinating until after the seed has been dispersed and conditions become suitable for growth. They usually ripen in the summer or fall. But you do not want the seeds to germinate before winter in most cases. There are always exceptions. Plants are very diverse, but that's going to be a situation for the ones we're talking about today. And therefore, most of them are amenable to outdoor sowing in pots, putting those pots out in either the autumn or winter. And this lets nature do a lot of the work for us. It makes it quite simple. But we're also going to talk about some of these requirements that the different species have, so you understand, how to tweak the process if you either would like to do so, or it always helps. I find it's always, it just really enriches my appreciation to know what's going on, even if somebody else like nature is doing the work. And of course, if you want to stratify artificially, you must know what treatments to use for each type of seed and, how to do it. Let's see. So today, the way we're going to go about this is to show you a short video and then have a discussion by Maggie about the artificial stratification steps that may be needed for various species. We'll have a question and answer session about germination requirements, then talk about starting seedlings in pots outdoors and growing them up to planting size. And at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about where you can get seeds. Let's see. So this video is from the Wild Seed Project, and
welcome everyone to Seed Sowing 101. I'm Anna Fielkoff, and we will get started just now. It's 5 o'clock and we have a lot of things to talk about tonight. I'm Anna Fielkoff and I'm the program manager for Wild Seed Project. And tonight, Heather McCargo, our founder and seed program manager, is going to talk to you about just the basics of seed sowing and give you a little online tutorial. So if you don't know much about Wild Seed Project, we are a small nonprofit located in southern Maine, and we actually do a lot of different things besides just selling native seeds and promoting the growing of native seeds. We have lots of educational programming online and in person. We have a very information-rich website with beautiful images and just packed full of how-to resources. We also have an initiative called the Pledge to Rewild, where we encourage people to take the pledge and show their commitment to restoring native plants to their landscapes, whether they be in rural, suburban, or urban areas. And then we also have annual publications that we put out. Recently, we've been putting out guides, and we have actually a really lovely native tree guide that talks about 31 species of native trees and how you can use them in the landscape and what their wildlife value is. So just to tell, wanted to give you a rundown of a little bit about what we do as Wild Seed Project. Now I'm going to pass it on to Heather as she sets up for the tutorial. Let me just switch over and stop sharing my screen. Spotlight Heather. And then we have our seed cam. So Heather, take it away.
Hey, welcome everybody. I'm thrilled that you're all here, and this is the perfect time of year to sow native seeds. And today couldn't have been more cold and raw and dark, and we had our first dusting of snow in Maine, which is great weather to think about sowing the seeds. And the reason the native seeds need to be sown in the late fall or early winter is they are from a northern temperate climate, so the seeds have evolved. Many of the species need to go through a winter cold period before the seeds will germinate. So what I'm going to do is walk you through what the ingredients that you need and the process, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So the first thing you will need is seeds, and so one of the things we do at Wild Seed Project is we sell seeds of hand-collected native wild-type native seeds. We are in New England, and there are other seed companies in other parts of the country, but we're a good choice if you're in the Northeast. Then the next thing you need is where you're going to sow the seeds, and we recommend, get that showing in the picture, sowing seeds in pots. Now you might be wondering, if these are native seeds, why can't I just go take them out in my yard and throw them in some bare soil there? And the reason is all soil, 2 square inches of soil will have thousands of seeds in it, most of which will be probably annual weed seeds or invasive species, not probably the native seeds. And those weed seeds will all germinate and grow much faster than the native species. So we have found it's very successful when you sow seeds in pots, and they need to be a durable pot, so a clay pot or these heavy duty plastic pots. The fiber pots aren't a good choice. They're really designed for annuals like vegetables and annual flowers so that they degrade right away. Well, you need something more durable. And then the soil I recommend people use is a good organic potting soil, which there's many brands out there that are available now. Make sure you get one that has a good amount of organic compost in it, as opposed to a more traditional potting soil, which is a sterile peat moss mixture, and peat moss is, a mined product, and then it's sterile, and so they will typically add some sort of chemical fertilizer, often even an osmocote, which is these little balls of fertilizer that are designed to slowly release, and the outer coating is plastic, which then stays in the soil. So get a potting soil with, good organic potting soil with compost in it, and that will contain lots of the different beneficial microorganisms that are beneficial to plant life. Put it in the pot, and then it's very important to press the potting soil down firmly, because when you just scoop it in, it tends to be fluffy and it will pit and mound, and the seeds will get sucked down into it if you don't press it down. So press it down either with your hand, or you can use the bottom of another pot. Then you will need to make labels, and again, the biodegradable labels, like a wooden label, that's great for your vegetable, but it won't last long enough for the native plants. These are all perennials, and you will probably need a label in it for a couple of years as you learn to get to know the plant. I like to use a pencil to write on the plastic label, because those what are marketed as indelible pens, they don't last forever. They often wash away within a couple months. So a pencil will last on the plastic for years, and you can also erase it and reuse the pencil. Then after we sow the seeds, I'll show you cover the seeds with coarse sand. This is available at any good hardware store. It's often called coarse, all-purpose coarse sand, and it's sort of textured where all the grains aren't the same size, unlike sandbox sand is very fine. This is more textured, and you just want to make sure, especially this time of year when you buy it, that it doesn't have any de-icing salts in it. And if you usually have to buy it in a 40-pound bag, so if you're like, I don't need all that sand, it's great for throwing on your walkway. Okay, so we've got the sand to cover the seeds. Then where the seeds are going to go is outside, and it's really important to cover the flats with wire mesh. Otherwise, cats, squirrels, chipmunks, other rodents will dig in the pot. So you can also just get this wire mesh at a hardware store, and the little holes are about a ½ an inch apart. You don't want chicken wire. Those holes are too big. A mouse or chipmunk can go right through that. And then you also need a gentle rain nozzle on whatever method of watering your plant. So one with little dots in it, or if it's a hose, make sure it's got a rain nozzle, not something that's designed to wash your car, which would blast the seeds away. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to sow 3 different species. I picked seeds of different sizes. The first is one of our native milkweeds, the swamp milkweed, and I'm first going to show you on this white plate because it's easier to see. So I like to pour the seeds out of the packet and put them in my left hand because I'm right-handed. And then I take all the seeds and I sprinkle it around what will be the pot. And I'm just showing you on the plate so you can sort of see. They can be close together. You know, I've got 4-inch pots here, so they're going to be about this close together in the pot. So now I'll do it in the actual pot. And native seeds are very different if you're from vegetables or a lot of annual flowers, which grow really quickly and get stunted if they're too close together. That's just not true with the native species. They are really like teenagers, and they all are much happier if they're germinating together. Then I take the sand, and the milkweed seeds tend to be quite big. They're about more than a 1/4 of an inch across. They're sort of flat actually. And a good rule of thumb for covering the seeds is to cover them to the depth of the thickness of the seed. So these seeds I'm going to cover about a 1/4 of an inch. And then I just sprinkle it around. And then you put the label in, very important, and push the label way down deep because you're taking this outside. And if you leave it sticking up a couple inches, a squirrel or chipmunk will pull it out and even switch pots with it. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a very small seed. And I'm going to show you, this is black-eyed coneflower. That might be better up higher. These are very small black seeds. They're little green lines. So again, look how closely together I'm sowing them all. That's how it will be in the pot. And because these are so dark, I'm going to actually show you in the pots a different small light colored seed. This is our bottled gentian. I'm going to sprinkle the seeds around. I don't know if that's, I'll hold this up closely. So these are tiny little seeds. And so small seeds barely get covered. That way. There you go. See how close together they are? So these, because they are less than, they're almost a 1/16 of an inch, it's almost like I'm just putting salt on food. Well, this would be heavy salt load, but I just sprinkle it lightly. You barely cover it. And some very small seeds like lobelias, they actually don't really get covered at all. So again, the rule of thumb is you cover the seeds to the depth of the thickness of the seed. So a sesame seed would be 1/8 of an inch, a sunflower seed would be a 1/4 of an inch, and a acorn would be 1 inch deep. Okay, and then the last species I'm going to show you how to sow are the asters. And because we clean all our seeds by hand, asters are a tiny little seed with a fluffy appendage, and we don't have any equipment that separates those fluffy appendages. So again, they end up, you just sew it all in together. When you're sowing the seeds outdoors, all these little, even chaff will just biodegrade. You couldn't, in a greenhouse, if you have a lot of other organic matter, you can get a lot of mold, but that does not happen when you're doing outdoor seed sowing. So now I'm going to take those same fluffy seeds and spread them as evenly as I can around. Put the label in, that I'm gonna push the label. Don't leave it sticking up. I'm going to push it way down so that to really read it, you have to pull it up to read it. And then cover these seeds. Sand makes a superior covering to the seeds than potting soil. And the reason is a lot of seeds need light to germinate. It's why when you till your soil, you bring all these seeds up from deep down, they get the light and they germinate. So sand lets a little bit of light through. There. Now I'm not going to water them now, but I would water them just lightly with, like I said, my watering can. You could also take a pot and stick it in a dish of water and let it absorb water through the bottom. And then you carry them outside. You find a flat piece of ground that's in the shade. And with the ungerminated seedlings, I really like to have people set them up in the shade because it will keep them moist all through the spring as you're waiting to germinate. So you find a flat piece of ground and then cover them with the wire mesh. And like I said, today would be a perfect day. There's a little dusting of snow on it. I might even scoop some up and sprinkle it on top to protect them a little, but it might go above freezing tomorrow. It might rain tomorrow and then get really cold again. So these native seeds love whatever our New England winter is going to throw at them. And in fact, they require it to break up the heavy seed coat. These are undomesticated plants. They have a heavy seed coat that needs that freeze and thaw. So then what you do is just, wait through the winter and be patient and trust that the seed, no matter what the weather does, you get really cold weather and then a warm spell, just these native seeds are adapted to that extremes of weather and will thrive in it. And then the first seeds, when do you look for germination? Well, some species will germinate here in Maine as early as late March, some of the really early ones. Lots of them will germinate in April. And in fact, the rainy, raw, cold, damp days, the kind of weather that, organic farmer would hate because they can't get out and plant their tropical or warm weather vegetable seeds. That is ideal germination weather for the native species. Often some of the earliest ones to germinate are the asters and penstemons, and then some of the more warm weather plants like jack in the pulpit is one of the last ones to germinate, and it's actually most of that plant family is from the tropics, so it's evolved for that. So you put it out and just wait, and then once they start germinating, one of the nice things, so if you look, these are 3 4-inch pots. I really encourage people to, try to sow between, first time people, try a variety of different species. So 4-inch pots, 9 pots would take up 1 square foot of space. And you can potentially have hundreds of seedlings germinating in the spring in 1 square foot of space. And so then people are always very anxious to get to plant their plants out in the garden right away. But most of the native species are perennials. They're not annual, so they have much slower growth. And, some species, a milkweed species, can grow a foot or even 18 inches in the first year. Other species will just stay an inch tall that whole first summer. So you can leave them in their pots. Once the pot starts to seem full and crowded, or you're noticing it's drying out more regularly, then you can take, what I like to have people do is not divide up the plants, but to take the whole pot, put your hand over the top with the germinated seedlings, tip it upside down and put it in a bigger pot. And let it grow on that way through the summer. So if it was a New England aster or one of the milkweeds, I'd put a 4-inch size pot that might have anywhere from 20 to 50 or even 100 seedlings in it, put in a gallon pot. If it seems to fill that space up quickly, just move it into a bigger pot. Now, if you were a nursery, you would end up dividing up those plants over the summer, but that does disturb the roots and it does slow the growth down. And so if you can just move the whole clump into a bigger pot and then wait, and from mid-September on is a great time to then divide up the plants and plant them out in your garden. I think that's everything. So I am ready now to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fantastic. So how we'll take questions is I started getting some in the chat box. So if you want to type any other questions in the chat box, I don't suspect we'll get to everybody's questions tonight, but we'll get through a fair few of them. And I'll read them aloud and then Heather can answer. So a first starting question can be, can you use a window screen instead of hardware cloth for your screen, or is the grid too small?
Yes, old window screen would be a great choice, and it's already got a frame in it. If you're planting nuts like acorns, you need to actually make a wire cage because the rodents can get through it. But with all these other small seeds, just a wire screen or old winter window screen would be a great choice. Yes.
Great. And what about planting in milk jugs for like a greenhouse effect? Is that a good thing to do?
I know plenty of people who have had great success to that. These plants don't need the extra protection of, it kind of makes a mini greenhouse. So what you really have to be careful is once the seeds germinate, they will germinate earlier because it does have a little greenhouse effect. But you have to make sure you pull the lid off once they germinate. It does have, where I find it works well is with the really small seeds like the lobelias. Now with our heating climate, we are getting such torrential rains. And that's a new problem that's, I'm dealing with, where sometimes the rain is so heavy, when it's raining 3 inches in a couple hours, and I can see where actually the milk jug would deflect most of that rain. So I know people who are happily doing it, so I'm all for it if you want to give it a try, but make sure once it germinates that you pull the lid off or you'll fry them. And it is what, I mentioned earlier about having the seed plats in the shade till they germinate. When people fail with seed sowing, the 2 biggest reasons are either they buried the seeds too deeply, and particularly if they covered it with dark potting soil. This is where the sand gives you a lot of extra leeway. The sand is also coarse and helps prevent the splashing out in the rain. And then the other way people don't succeed is that the seedlings start to germinate and then they dry out, and by late April, the sun can be really strong. And if you leave the house and go to work somewhere else every day, you can come home and your adorable little seedlings that had just started to germinate had fried. So waiting till they've germinated and send some roots down, and then the sun living species you can move into a sunnier spot.
Great. And yeah, that brings me to another question. A couple folks asked about if you need to water the pots at any time, and especially, while the seeds are still dormant.
Mm-hmm. No, so I usually, unless it's snowing or raining, when I'm carrying the pots outside, I water them before I put them outside. So for instance, these New England asters that are a little bit fluffier, the teeny seeds, if they're dry and you took them outside in the winter and it was windy, they could blow around. So that's where if you just water them a little bit, but no, you never have to. Okay, I shouldn't say never with the way our world is, but no, I never have to start watering till April sometime. So that's the beauty of the fall and winter seed sowing. The soil stays moist. The seeds are really well hydrated. In fact, something like New England asters, the aster seeds actually don't have to don't require winter cold period. You can sow them outdoors in the spring, but the ones that you sow out in the fall and winter will germinate much earlier than the ones you sow in April. So this pot I just sowed it here, this will be one of the early ones to germinate. If I sowed some more in early April, those will germinate weeks later. So these will get a head start. And it's just the seeds are so well hydrated from the long, cold, raw winter. And they won't mold. You know, people always are worried, are the native seeds going to rot? But no, that's domesticated plant. You know, so many of our crop plants and our annual flowers, those are from a tropical country. So when it's cold, raw weather, they do get stressed and can rot. But that won't happen with the native seeds.
Yeah, and so that makes me wonder, can you overwater your little seedlings in spring?
Yes, watering is probably one of the hardest chores. You can overwater, which again, when they're young, having them in part shade so they're not drying out so fast, you know, so it's better to wait and water when you see it needs it, especially in sort of April and early May. You know, the only time I don't water every day if it doesn't need it at that time of year. But if you're not keeping your eye on it, let's say you were going away for the weekend and it was early May, I'd water everything well before I went. So, you know, you can overwater, you can water heavily for a couple of days, but if you do it weeks on end, the more dry loving species like black-eyed coneflower would not be happy being overwatered, but swamp milkweed would love it.
Awesome. And what do we do about underneath the pots? Do you put anything under them?
You know, if I was going to put, so sometimes I put them on my brick paving. Sometimes I put, if you get extra wire mesh, you can put that underneath it too. I've used a board sometimes, but I've also put them directly on the ground. But, you know, if for some reason you had a lot of voles, you know, the voles are more not after seeds, they're off after roots. So these don't have the roots till the spring. So it wouldn't hurt to put something flat like this underneath it too, or another screen. Actually, if you've got a lot of old window screens, yes, they could be repurposed for native seed propagation.
Great. And then I have another question about just clarifying how many seeds do you need to plant per pot? Is it maybe a whole seed packet or do you split that up?
Yes, I sow seeds really thickly. You will see, I will have, you know, sometimes 200 seedlings in a little pot like this. So yes, in general, I recommend sowing our whole package of seeds in the pot. You could split it in two, but you can just move it up later. And they don't mind germinating close together. I think they almost prefer it. But if they are starting to look crowded, then you move that whole flat into a bigger pot. Or if you really felt like, you know, there's more than 100 seedlings in here, you could, you know, when you're ready to move it to a bigger part, you could do it in 4 sections, but not divide each one up individually. That will set it back for a couple of weeks.
And then one person has bought some seeds from Prairie Moon Nursery, which is a fantastic nursery in the Midwest. And they're wondering if they need to follow the specific germination code instructions or whether they can put their seeds in pots now, as we advise at Wild Seed Project.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, one of the reasons to do all your sowing now is one of the things that you know, has made people confused about native seed sowing is, you know, there's some species that only need a month of winter, 30 days, some need 60 days, some need 90 days, some need 120 days. So all that information, you know, this gets confusing to people. So no, you can just sow them outdoors now with them too. You know, you might have gotten some seeds from them that are moist stratified. They should be sown right away. So there are some species that they need, the embryo is immature when the seed ripens and they actually need a warm period, then a cold period, then a warm period to germinate. So in that case, you could just wait and sow them next summer instead of doing it now. But no, that's the beauty of this fall and winter seed sowing, is you can just do all of it now. This is what they would get in nature, obviously.
And what about flowers that do bloom the first year, like black-eyed Susan or spotted bee balm? When do you divide those and plant them?
Okay, so that's a great question, because there are some exceptions to growing them on in pots for the summer. Black-eyed coneflower will bloom. It's a rare native perennial that will bloom the first year within a couple months of you sowing it. So you can right away divide them up and start planting them out. Spotted bee balm sometimes will bloom the first year, sometimes not till the second year. Spotted bee balm is a real dry land plant, and some of our plants from really dry soil areas really hate plastic pots. So that's one that grows really well in clay pots, or you could plant out in your landscape sooner. It's just, if you go plant, by the time these are big enough to plant in your garden, it's already June, and it's pretty hard to take a juvenile plant, put it in your garden, and keep it watered, checking on it a couple times a week when everything else is growing all over the place. So something like spotted bee balm, I tend to just take that pot of seedlings and put in a much bigger pot. But black-eyed coneflower is one that you can plant in the landscape that first year. Same with the sundial lupin. That one doesn't transplant very easily, so I tend to just sow a couple of those seeds in each pot and then put them in their permanent location in the summer. So there are a few exceptions.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think we're out of time for questions, but that was a really great group of questions, and there will be another seed sowing tutorial on January 12th. It's more of a lunchtime tutorial. We were experimenting.
Okay, I'm going to go back to our presentation, and Maggie's going to talk about artificial stratification, and then we are going to answer the questions you've put in the chat or open it up to where you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask more of your questions. But I wanted to start off with that video because really Heather does a better job than anybody I know, and we certainly couldn't improve upon it. But I'll advance the slide and let Maggie go from here.
Great, thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you everyone for being here today. We had originally planned for this program to possibly be a live program, and I don't think there's any way that we could have accommodated nearly 80 people. So in a way, maybe it worked out great that we're providing this virtual program for you. And as we started thinking about how to demonstrate seed planting, Heather McCargo's videos are just so simple and straightforward, and she has a great overhead camera. So we thought it would be best to just go ahead with showing her video. But Lydia asked me to follow up on a few things that were talked about in the video and to share some of my own personal experiences. As Lydia mentioned earlier today, my name is Maggie Redfern, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Connecticut College Arboretum. And my personal experience in seed sowing started with woody plants, so trees and shrubs. And when I moved to New London, I had quite a few trees and shrubs to plant in my garden and got those in and realized there's a lot of space between these plants, and started experimenting with growing perennials and grasses, also from seed. So I'm a little bit newer with growing those, but the techniques are still very similar. And what we're doing with planting these seeds, it's basically mimicking what's happening in nature. Lydia is calling what I'm doing artificial propagation. I might like to think of it more as assisted propagation. Plants grow their own seeds on their own without us every year, and you'll find once you get these plants going in your garden that they'll start spreading in your garden on their own. A plant might produce thousands of seeds in a year, but we only need a few of those to survive, to continue the lineage of the plant or to maybe fill in the bare spaces in our garden. But as gardeners growing seeds, we definitely want more success, better success. And so that's why starting seeds in pots and protecting them really provides a better result, better success than just sprinkling a few seeds in your garden and seeing what might happen. And I'll also say that experience and observation over the years will definitely increase your success. Every year you'll find you are a little bit more successful, what works, what doesn't work. Just to start with, I'm going to go over a few of the terms and things that Heather mentioned, just for clarification. And Lydia has this germination code up, which you don't need to necessarily go into that, but it's just up, as a I guess, background screen as I talk about some of these things. As Heather mentioned, though, many of the seeds that we have, the native seeds, need a treatment to get germination. If we just take seeds in the fall and plant them, they're not going to germinate. The seeds have I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the term, but the seeds need a trigger to get them to germinate. And that trigger is a combination of water and cold temperatures. If seeds were just to start germinating when they drop on the ground in the fall, they'd probably die from our cold New England winters. So there's all of these seed treatments and all of these germination codes that are listed here. And this is from years of trial and error from many different propagators, that these germination codes have been developed to overcome seed dormancy. It's almost like a cookbook, like we look in a cookbook to figure out how to make the perfect cake. These germination codes are to help you figure out what needs to be done. And to overcome the dormancy of the seeds. And these techniques and the germination codes that are here are for seeds that you would be artificially stratifying or giving that cold treatment, that simulation of winter in your refrigerator over the winter. And that's what these are based on. Heather's technique eliminates the need for that by just starting the seeds outside. But in all of these New England plants, even trees, shrubs, perennials, the treatment needs to happen to break the dormancy. So in my refrigerator, I have all of these. I wonder if. I'm sorry. I'll show my pictures. I'll show the demonstration at the end. Sorry about that. So some of the terms we use: stratify, that's just this simulating winter. It's almost like stratifying layers, and that's the layers of soil. And this is where that name comes from, where seeds are in the soil for the winter time. And that's, whether they're outside or in your fridge, they need moisture and they need soil or sand to break that dormancy. And what's happening is the seeds are going to imbibe. They're going to bring in water to trigger germination of the seed. The seed has to absorb that water. Water has to be added to the seed for it to start growing. We also talk about scarification, which is commonly needed by legumes, and we'll have a few of these legumes available at the plant sale next week. And scarification is basically nicking the very hard seed coat, an impervious seed coat, almost like a shell around the seed, so that the water can get in and the seed can germinate. In nature, this happens through an animal's digestive system or the freeze-thaw cycle over winter. But as we do this in a refrigerator, we'll need to assist the seeds. We'll need to break that seed coat to get the water in. One of the common ways of doing this is pouring hot water over the seeds and letting the seeds soak in that water for like 24 hours. That helps to break the hard seed coat. Another technique you can use is to put the seeds on a plate or on a block of wood and sand them gently with like sandpaper or a file. But that's actually a lot of work, and I always find I mess up my fingers when I try to sand little seeds. You know, the seed coats, you know, are easiest broken down by the technique of putting them outside where they're going, where we're letting nature do the work of the freeze-thaw cycle to kind of break dormancy. We can use the file or sandpaper. Or the hot water. Those are 3 different techniques that can be used to break the hard seed coat. And this is specifically on the legumes, the bean family plants.
Yeah, Maggie, sorry to interrupt. I think we may have some illustrations of these, so let me advance the slides and
Super.
let's see.
Great, thanks, Lydia. So here we're showing this artificial stratification method, and this is, I'll show you my bags later, but you know, usually I start with a mixture. I personally use a sterile soil and sand mix, but here the sand mix I think works just as well, especially for the perennial seeds, where we have a small bowl of sand, and make it moist but not too wet, and that's what we're seeing on this left picture here, is just adding a little bit of water to the sand so that there's the moisture content in the sand, and then we add the seeds into the mix, kind of stir it up. Like I said, it's almost like a recipe, right? It's almost like a cookbook here. Mix up the seeds and then drop them in a plastic bag. Make sure you label the bag. I think we haven't mentioned it enough yet, but labeling seeds is so important. You know, whether you're storing them in your fridge or you're putting them out in your garden, I guarantee you're not going to remember the name of the plant if you have a couple of pots out there in your garden. So be sure to label your plants. And then the picture here on the far right is showing the sprinkling of the seeds on top of soil in the spring after the plants have gone through their cold period. So whether it's a 30-day cold period, a 60-day cold period, these are kind of the things that are the recipes on the germination codes that Lydia was showing previously. You know, some things will require a little bit longer time to break their dormancy. And then like the ones on the right, it's just showing sprinkling the seeds, and this can be done outside. You can also do this inside. I have a lot of seeds that are ready to go now, and I'll start my seeds in a small room that's kind of like a sunroom, although the plants don't necessarily need full sunshine as they get started to germinate. They really are just triggered by the moisture in the seeds and the warmth is what's going to get them going. So Lydia, if you want to jump to the next slide, I think we have just a picture of the technique used for putting hot water on seeds. I usually just do this, you know, directly into like a mason jar or something, put my seeds in a mason jar and put the hot water on the seeds and let them imbibe the water overnight so that the seeds are ready to go, ready to be put into the bags and with the sand and be stored for 30 to 60 days to get them going. I should also mention at this point that if you put seeds in water, most of the seeds will hopefully sink. And those seeds are the ones that have imbibed the water. They're heavy enough, they have healthy embryos in them, and they will sink to the bottom. So oftentimes when I'm growing, and it's really easy to see with something that's larger, like an acorn, if you put a bunch of acorns in a cup of water, the ones that sink to the bottom are the good seeds. They have a heavy embryo in there and they can absorb the water. If they float to the top, those seeds are no good. It's not even worth planting them. So make sure, especially with the heavier seeds, you know, the sink test is a good way to test seeds. Lydia, if you want to jump to the next one. And here we see just some of the setups that people have outside for starting these plants. Instead of starting the seeds in pots inside, you can start them directly outside, and just be sure to provide protection, because you know, curious animals are sure to get in there and stir up your seeds. And then I think the next slide is just a picture of some of our legume seeds, and this is kind of a typical looking legume seed. The ones that do need the extra scarification to get them to germinate, or to imbibe, to get the water in the seeds. And then I think our next slide is the questions. So I see we have a few questions in the chat, and I am going to answer those. And if folks have additional questions, you're welcome to answer those. So let me go back.
Maggie, I've stopped the sharing. So actually, if you wanted to show anything in your window, you're welcome to do that. I'll go to the chat and
Sure.
at the top of our list.
Okay, so just to show, this is kind of my technique for how I put seeds in the fridge. You know, be sure to label the plant. This is Ilex glabra, which is our inkberry, a native holly. And I put the location from where I get the seeds, as well as the date that I put it in the refrigerator for cold treatment. So you can see this went in on January 15th, 2022. And then I usually just like roll these up and I stick them in a jar, or just stick them in the back of a drawer in my refrigerator to get the seeds going. To get them the cold treatment that they need. And then just to show, and Lydia will have more pictures of this, this is the pots that I use for starting inside. It's just a nice shallow pot, and very much like Heather did, just sprinkle the seeds over the top. 6 of these fit really nicely in a tray. These are kind of standard like vegetable trays that you can get from places like Johnny's and Fedco. And that's what I use for starting inside the house. So let's see, we have a couple questions.
Yep, I can read those questions to you. Let me go through the chat questions before we take live questions from the floor, if people will just bear with us.
That sounds great. And if people have questions they want to ask live, feel free to just raise your hand. If you go into the reactions button at the bottom is the raise hand feature. You're welcome to do that too. Yep.
So let's start with the chat questions. So the first chat question is, what happens if the soil is frozen and then rain and ice forms? Will this work? The answer is yes. I think the key is that you do want your what's in the pot to be able to drain well. If it's not saturated and puddling with water, it should not really frost heave. And remember, you're just mimicking what happens in nature. And so this is fine. Obviously, when you plant your seeds and put it out, it won't be frozen yet, but they may freeze once they go outside in the winter, and that's just fine. Next question is, if you are growing for plugs, would you plant the seeds in smaller containers or even a flat of tiny sections? And I think Maggie, maybe I'll let you answer this one.
Sure. So starting, for home growing, for growing in plugs, a lot of these seeds, especially the ones that are collected from home gardens, they haven't been tested for viability. And, maybe we'll get 50 to 75% germination on these seeds. So I think it works well to start in the larger, or, a 4-inch pot and sprinkle all of your seeds in there. If you specifically want plugs, I recommend transplanting them later in the year, later in the summer. I think it kind of depends on what you're ultimately going to do with them. I presume you are wanting to put them in plugs so that you can sell them or do a very large planting somewhere. And as Heather mentioned, sometimes the plants get a little bit stunted when you transplant them like that. But if you wait until fall, maybe you're going to do a spring planting or something, you can transplant them in the fall into plug style trays, and then overwinter them in very similar techniques to what we're recommending for the seed starting, where they have a bit of protection over the winter. They don't need to be in the bright sun for the winter, just to give them a little bit of protection.
Thanks, Maggie. Okay, then Russ Cohen had a comment. As an alternative to labeling writing on the label with pencils, he put in the chat a link to a marker that he's found is much more durable. So if you like a dark garden marker, you can save the chat and click on the link that Russ has provided there. And apparently he's had very good success with this. And yes, we will be providing the links to these germination codes pages. I think we wanted to show them to you just because I know many of us have bought seeds from Prairie Moon in the past, and they have that complex set of codes. Just for a little context, my sense is that they do this because they are really catering to the more traditional nursery growing public that some of their customers are, and to growing in the traditional soilless starting mixes, which is not what we are recommending. But if you use the soilless mixes, then they don't have those living organisms that, for example, the legumes need. And so you need to add an artificial inoculum to improve your germination. But if you're using organic potting soil that has natural compost, you want to make sure it's a brand that doesn't have weed seeds in it. But other than that, what it does have is a living microbial community that helps to support these seeds much better as they germinate.
Lydia, it looks like we have a couple other questions. One is saying, is there still time this year to winter sow the seeds that will be available next week? And yes, there definitely is still time to winter sow the seeds outdoors. Most of these seeds need just a short period of time to trigger the spring germination. So 30 to 60 days of temperature swings should be enough to break the dormancy of the seeds. And if you even wanted to put them in your fridge, you probably have, or you definitely have plenty of time as well, because most of these only need, according to the germination codes, 30 to 60 days. So if you think about it and you're going to actually be planting your seeds outside, now is a perfect time to start that. Do I seal the bags that go in the fridge? Yes, I do seal the bags. I should mention that when I put the seeds into the sand or soil mix, there is moisture in there, and by sealing the bags, we keep the moisture in the bag and in the seeds. I do occasionally check my seeds. I feel like especially if I'm growing acorns, and I know we're not talking so much about woody plants, but once the seeds start to absorb that water, the soil is actually drying out. So sometimes I'll add just a spoonful of water to re-moisten that mix. Let's see, when collecting native seeds, is it better to keep them in an envelope until planted, or jars preferred? Personally, I keep them in envelopes and have really good success with that. When I say I put it in the jar in the fridge, it's just to keep them separate so they're not mixing in with all my produce and things like that. But the paper envelopes work well. If your seeds are dry, just to store them until you're ready to winter sow them, envelopes are great. It also helps the seeds to continue to breathe, so that if there is any moisture in there, they're not going to get moldy or decompose.
Yeah, and if I may add a comment, Maggie, so while it's really getting a little off topic for this program, what we may do is in the fall is do something where we go more in depth into collecting seeds, processing them and storing them. I guess, yes, you want to make sure they dry out when you first collect them in the fall, and you also want to give an opportunity for any little bugs and things to crawl out. So before you put them away, otherwise there are some species that are particularly susceptible to seed weevils and other seed eating insects. So you want to make sure you get rid of them before you put your seed away, or you may find lots of plump, happy little insects and a lot of damaged seeds.
So there's another question. I'm just grabbing my little display here. How are the seeds collected? I'm almost embarrassed to show you all this, but I don't find that my seeds need a lot of special treatment for storage. And in the fall, as I find seeds that I want to collect, sometimes I'm not that well prepared for collecting if I happen to be at a friend's house or something. And so sometimes the seeds will just go into an envelope that I have on hand. So like the New London Homeless Hospitality Center sends me envelopes, and I just put the seeds in here. So, and always label what's in there. But the seeds are just stored dry inside here. I wish I could show this better, but they're just, stored dry in the envelope. And I keep them in my basement in a cool place. We don't want them next to a heater. We don't want them to dry out too much. And this is just usually, I'll keep these seeds for a year or two. This is Little Blue Stem that I collected this fall. Little Blue Stem doesn't need a pre-treatment, so I'll just be planting those directly once I get things started. But yeah, I just keep this like little basket that I made in an Arboretum program several years ago. And I just kind of stack up my seeds in there, and it keeps them really nicely.
Okay, there's another comment or a question about using hydrogen peroxide to help deter mold growing in the bags. And I guess I will comment. I have occasionally seen mold, and I think Heather's addressed that by basically saying if the seeds are too wet, you want the stratifying sand to be moist, but not wet. So you want it, if you grab a handful, you don't want to be able to squeeze any water out of it, but it should cake. You should have a ball in your hand. So if you moisten the sand, squeeze out the excess water, then put it back in a dry bowl, add your seeds, that's about the right amount of moisture. I haven't really tried hydrogen peroxide. I think it would work fine for larger seeds with hard coats. For the very tiny seeds, I might worry a little bit about actually damaging some of the seeds. I can't say from personal experience for small seeds, at least.
Lydia, it looks like we have one more question, and I know you have some more slides to show folks that will go into some more detail on some of the specific seeds that we're going to have available next week. But someone's asking about planting pecans, and definitely pecans you can grow from seed, not necessarily the ones that you get at the grocery store, but if you have a source for pecans, you can grow those, very similar to growing black walnuts. They definitely need to be protected against the squirrels, because the squirrels are very curious about especially those larger seeds. And as Lydia mentioned, and as someone else was asking, at the Arboretum, we typically do a fall seed collecting program. And I'm sure we'll do one again next fall. Takes place all outdoors for the most part, so it would be safe to do. And we can see what the interest from folks is, whether we focus on perennials or woody plants, or maybe do a couple sessions so that we can collect as many seeds as possible. But Lydia, why don't you share your screen again and show the other slides you have?
Yeah, I know there were a few more questions.
Sorry.
And I guess I'll just address one of them before I go to my screen share again. Potting soil. So we're not really in the business of recommending too many brands. However, I will mention that at the seed sale, we will have some small bags available of a brand that a number of our members have had good experience with.
And I see there's this other question, Lydia, as you get your screen share going again. Is there anything to be concerned with when putting seeds in the fridge and taking them out several times? And I would say the answer is no. I mean, that's kind of what's happening in nature, the cycle of freeze thaw. Although I do want to just reiterate, these are in the refrigerator. It only takes about a 42-degree temperature to break the dormancy. They don't have to be frozen. They don't have to be in your freezer. So that's just something to note, that they don't have to be totally frozen if you're doing the artificial or assisted technique of stratification.
Right. Thank you, Maggie. Okay, so I'll try to do this pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have time for more questions. Hopefully going through a few examples will answer some of your questions. And these are just a few of the species I pulled out to try to show you some different types of the perennials. And these are also plants for which we will have seeds at our sale. This first one, Partridge pea, Acrista fasciculata, is actually an annual, and it's a legume, but you can grow it very similarly by the techniques we have talked about. The difference, since it is an annual, is once it germinates, it will grow relatively quickly, and you will want to transplant it out so that it can finish its development in the ground, develop good roots. This is a wonderful pollinator plant and also a great nurse crop as a legume because it will fix nitrogen and put nitrogen into the soil. So it's great to plant around the base of larger plants. And here, most of you are probably familiar with the milkweeds, but just this one I'll just mention. So the butterfly milkweed is a good milkweed choice for drier locations. It is a clumping plant, not rhizomatous. And it's planted both as a nectar source and obviously as a larval host for monarch butterfly caterpillars. And this just shows you that they are quite palatable to monarchs, even at a small size. For butterfly weed, you do want to, and for common milkweed also, these are both milkweeds that like to develop taproots. So you do probably, they will grow better if you transplant them out once they are a few inches in size and have a few true leaves. They won't get as stunted. Otherwise, they will tend to get stunted growing in the pots. And once you put them in the garden, you don't want to move them because they will develop that taproot. So they're really, once they are out in the garden, they'll establish, and then they don't want to be moved. And that's in contrast to the swamp milkweed, which is more of a moisture-loving plant. And since it grows in wetter areas, it develops a very different type of root system. It's a clumper, not a spreader, so it does not spread by rhizomes. So that it makes a great plant for the home garden. And it is a little more forgiving for transplanting at almost any stage. So that's one you can hold in a pot as long as there is space in the pot for the roots to develop well. Here is another wetland plant, the Hibiscus mosquito swamp rose mallow. Again, a beautiful, very desirable plant. This has a large round seed, which is shown at the right in this picture, that ripens in these seed capsules in the fall. This is a seed that is very susceptible to weevil damage. So if you collect the seeds, you do need to make sure they don't look like beads with holes that go all the way through them, because that means they've been eaten by a weevil and will not germinate. But these are create larger seedlings. And so as you see here, these are ones, even if you start them many to a pot, as you can do that, as Heather recommends, but once they start growing up, since the seedlings are rather large, they will grow much better if you do spread them out. So this is one of the exceptions to the rule, a case where you may want to put a single individual or maybe two or at most three into a quart-sized pot, so they really have the space to grow up, because this is going to create an almost shrubby looking plant, although it is an herbaceous plant, so it will die down every winter and regrow in the spring. And this is just what the adult plants look like. There are two color variants to this native. One is the white with the crimson eye, and the other is the pink. We will have both color morphs at our sale. Little blue stem, one of our most wonderful native grasses, to me, it's a really iconic of our area, although it grows throughout a wide range across North America. Like many grasses, this is sown very shallowly, and you see on the left a picture from Maggie, how she has sprinkled it on the top of her pot. And one barely needs to bury it. Again, you can sprinkle a little bit of sand just to help hold it down, or if you just press the seed down so you get a good seed to soil contact. Another trick that I have done is I put a little bit of chopped straw on top, again, to just help hold the seed in place. It does also help to hold in moisture. And it's not necessary. I do it, it's just something that I've done and has worked well for me. And you can see the seedlings coming up through that chopped straw. Little blue stem makes very deep roots. It's a warm growing native grass. So in my hands, it generally has germinated a little bit later in the spring, but once it gets growing, it grows rapidly. But it's a very tough and forgiving plant. And if you're like me, who gets overcommitted and forgets about some of my pots, or just doesn't get around to transplanting when I think the plants really are ready, they will sit there. They'll grow a little bit, and they'll grow a lot above ground, but they'll grow a lot of roots. And even if they're in a shallow pot, I have rescued them. So growing in a flat that may be only 2.5 or 3 inches deep, if there is room, what they'll do is they'll simply grow their roots sideways. So when you gently remove these plants from the pot and shake some of the soil, you'll find you actually have very long roots. And you can try to preserve as many of them as possible when you're planting. I mean, don't wrap them up. You'll have to cut them to the depth of your planting hole, but you can do that. And as I say, and as Maggie suggested also, if necessary, you can overwinter and plant the following spring. So I have had success doing that, transplanting these grasses into plug trays, letting them overwinter, and then planting them in the following spring. And then they really take off, and they will certainly bloom that second year. And this is just the mature little blue stem. As I said, a beautiful grass. Also, blue stem, many of the grasses, the reason they don't need stratifying, the cold moist stratification, is because they naturally hold their seeds on their stems over the winter. And it's not until the rains of the following year, when the dead stems start breaking down and fall to the ground, that if you think about that natural process, that's how the wild seeds disperse and germinate. It's only when the stems fall down and that seed then comes in contact with the soil that it can germinate. But it's generally held up and dry over the winter. So getting an intermittent rain or snow and then drying off in between does not trigger the germination during the cold weather. They really need warmer temperatures in conjunction with moisture to germinate. Then this is Liatris, our Nova Anglia, our native blazing star. And you can see each of these seeds comes with a little parachute, and we don't bother taking off the parachutes, or pappus, as they are called, that help the seeds disperse. Similarly, goldenrods and asters are fluffy seeds. And it doesn't really, it doesn't interfere with sowing them. So we just leave them. It's a little more natural. And in fact, I figure it's an organic material that just breaks down in the pot and actually helps to hold moisture around the seeds. And also if you put the coarse sand on them, yeah, it's another little anchor under the sand. And you can see in the upper right, these are as the seedlings just begin with their cotyledons, and you'll see one little blade-like true leaf coming out of the center. Within a month or two, these blades get longer, but this is a species that will basically only grow a couple of inches in the first year. And what it's doing is actually growing both roots and beginning to develop a corm or a bulb-like structure right under the ground, which is where it stores up its energy for blooming, usually in the second or even possibly the third year. So you need a little patience, at least in my experience with Liatris. So I would transplant these up into larger pots or move them into a larger pot in the fall, or you can put them into plug trays, however you want to overwinter them or put them out. But just understand that here's one that it's doing what it normally does by expending most of its energy growing roots and a corm, and it probably won't bloom that first year. When it does, though, it is a real pollinator magnet. Butterflies love it, bees love it. Unfortunately, rabbits and deer also love it. So that's another caution that it's better, in my experience, to let these plants grow a little larger in a protected place before you put them out. And even then, you may need to provide them with some sort of protection against herbivores, especially if you're doing a mass planting that just looks like a salad bowl to a bunny. Goldenrods, as Heather mentioned, these can germinate. They need the cold moist stratification, but they can germinate quite early. And here is the gray goldenrod mass germinating in a pot. And you can see, even though crowded, these seedlings all develop just fine. They don't mind being in a crowd. And you can cut the pot apart into sections later for transplanting or for potting up. It all works fine. You don't want to leave them crowded over the second winter. That's not a good idea, because at that point, if they are too crowded, they will be a little more susceptible to fungal damage and mold. Especially this species, which really likes dry, sandy. It grows best in kind of more upland dry gardens. It's quite drought tolerant. And here it is. It's also one of the faster maturing goldenrods, and it propagates itself. While it is a perennial, it also maintains itself in your garden by self-seeding. Penstemons. Again, there are many of you are probably familiar with Penstemon Digitalis, the foxglove beard tongue. There are many cultivars out in the nurseries, but we really encourage planting the straight species because cultivars, especially with red leaves, are no longer as functional ecologically. They are no longer, while they may produce nectar and pollen, their leaves are not as palatable to the insects that use them as larval hosts. So penstemons are perennial, but there are two popular species that we will have available, and they're each great. They're quite different in their own ways, while the flowers may have similar shape. Penstemon hirsutus here, the hairy penstemon, hairy beard tongue, grows fairly quickly, and it's an early blooming species. It will generally bloom at least a month. Once mature, it will bloom usually in May or early June, several weeks, maybe a month before the taller foxglove beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis. They look somewhat similar as seedlings. The digitalis is a larger stature plant, and the seedlings will grow larger rosettes of leaves. Again, they don't mind being crowded in the pot initially. And the Penstemon hirsutus, it's great. Also, we encourage planting out not single plants, but clusters of plants, both so that you will get cross-pollination if you want seed production, but also to maintain the population so you don't have to replant them. I did say they were perennial, but some perennials are somewhat short-lived, and in nature, they tend to maintain themselves as a population just by constantly reseeding themselves. And you can have that happen in your garden too, but then you need sort of a minimum number of plants to do that. So it's better to have a cluster of the plants. And here is a second year Penstemon hirsutus beginning to grow in a young meadow setting. That's what the flowers look like. So they are really wonderful flowers for bumblebees and long-tongued bees and hummingbirds in the spring. The lobelias. So they're also gorgeous garden plants and wonderful for pollinators. The blue lobelia, later blooming, but they look similar. So you're probably familiar with the red cardinal flower, which likes somewhat moister places. Blue lobelia is a little more adaptable to either moist or moderately kind of average, not super dry, but it's a little more adaptable than the red cardinal flower. These are tiny, tiny seedlings when they first emerge, again, from tiny, tiny seeds. That reminds me to mention, another way to avoid seed washout in case we have torrential rains when you put your pots outside. So the window screens are helpful because they do help sort of break the heavy rains from directly hitting the pots or the milk jugs. And another thing you could do is put a layer of kind of garden cloth, rime, something that is light and still allows light through, but will again help to block the water and not let it land heavily on the pot surface and wash out your seeds. So that's another thing you can do. You can literally wrap or put a layer of the garden fabric over the top underneath the screen. So the garden fabric, again, animals can chew through it. So I would put it under the screen or over the screen. You still need the screen because that's really to deter critters. But the lobelias grow little rosettes, and they are somewhat slow growing. I have had cardinal flower get to blooming size by the second year. And but on the other hand, you can put them in pots in the fall and overwinter the immature plants in the fall and then put them out the following spring. That works very well in my experience for the lobelias. And this is a clump of the blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. Let's see, I think I already did talk about Asclepias tuberosa, but of course, these are the seeds, the large seeds and the seedlings. As I mentioned, tuberosa, you probably want to transplant sooner than you would the swamp milkweed. The swamp milkweed's a little more forgiving because the root development of these two plants is quite different. And just want to conclude here by saying there's no one right way. We're just showing you from our experience what Maggie and I, from what's worked for us. Whether you choose to transplant single or multiple plants per pot kind of depends on how you want to use the plants, but bearing in mind that, again, disturbing the roots is going to set the plants back somewhat. You can minimize that setback by when you transplant. Meaning if you do it, cool, moist, sort of cool, damp days, cloudy days are the best days, as we know, for transplanting. You don't want a windy day where a dry wind is going to quickly dry out small roots. And as the plants grow, if you're interested in having them grow up as quickly as possible, you really do want to get them into deeper pots. As perennials, they develop strong root systems. And as has been mentioned, there are some species that will do very little growing above ground in the first year. Some of the legumes like baptisias, I've found that to be the case. Eupatorium hysapifolium also. there's several that it looks like the plants grow a little bit and they stop, but what they're doing is putting all their energy into root growth. It is nice to grow, in my experience, to let the plants grow somewhat larger before you try to install them in a garden, particularly if you're doing this with volunteers. It's easier to handle a larger plant and easier to monitor them and see where they are even once they're planted out in the garden setting. So we do recommend that if you're starting plants this spring, for the perennials, target them for fall planting. September or even early October in our region is a really wonderful time to put them out. They'll have some time before the frost to establish their roots, and it also in the early spring, and then they'll just be ready to take off in the spring. Alternatively, you can overwinter them in pots or plug trays and plant them out in the spring. So I think that's all that I have. Really, I guess this slide was just to remind me to say that, it's just to celebrate the biodiversity of the different native perennials we have within each of these groups of types of perennials. The flowers look similar and they attract maybe similar pollinators, but the different species really adapt to different garden conditions. As mentioned, butterfly weed, great for drier gardens, whereas the swamp milkweed is really better for your average to moist gardens. From Monarda, the spotted bee balm, again, wonderful for those tough, dry places, dry, sandy places, whereas Monarda fistulosa is extremely adaptable. And there is another Monarda, while not truly native to New England, is a good pollinator plant called Bradbury's Monarda. And to me, its advantage is it's a really early bloomer. It will bloom in our region in May. It's also a nice clump former and a short plant. So in terms of people who want a more designed look, it's a great front of the border species. And has all the benefits of the Monardas in terms of supporting different insects and pollinators. I've already talked about the penstemons, both the hairy penstemon, which is short, it only gets about 18 inches tall, versus the foxglove penstemon, which is probably this one we're more familiar with, which gets quite tall, 3 to 4 feet. Again, planting different species extends the bloom time for these types of plants in your garden, because you'll have one bloom and then the other. This is true of the liatris. If you plant multiple species of liatris, we have only one truly native, but the dense blazing star, there are several other liatris species who come from, we'll call them nearby regions to the south and west of New England, but are perfectly hardy in our area. And in a pollinator garden, they are also good plants to extend the blooming season of this class of plant. Goldenrods and asters, of course, are critical fall bloomers for our migrating butterflies and many, many insects and birds and other wildlife. Not only that use the flowers, but use the stems to overwinter in. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to emphasize that I encourage you to plant, try out more than one type from each of these groups, but look for the ones that are best suited for your garden conditions, because within each group, there are plants that are suited to drier and wetter sites, and plants that have different growth habits. You may not want a rhizomatous plant, in which case there are mountain mints. The Virginia mountain mint is more of a clumper. It will self-seed though, so you will be able to spread the plants around, but you can do that by the seedlings. And again, I can open up to questions now. I think there's a number in the chats. So Maggie.
Yeah, I've answered most of the questions in the chat. One that I don't have familiarity with is, does cinnamon help prevent damping off?
I haven't tried it on native seeds. I actually use it on my orchids. And yes, cinnamon is known to contain chemicals with antifungal properties. If you use a little bit, I don't see that it would hurt, but I've never really had the need for it. The nice thing I think about the sand too is the sand being inorganic does not tend to support fungal growth. And that's why putting sand as a topping over your seeds not only helps to prevent washout, but I think it's less susceptible to turning green and growing algae or fungus in the spring when your seeds are trying to germinate. And yet it does help hold in the moisture into the soil layer where your seeds are actually going to grow their roots. Let's see, are there any other chat questions? Otherwise, I think there was a hand raised.
Yeah, go for the hand raised.
Okay. Hang on a second. I'm going to stop my sharing so I can see who's raising their hands.
It looks like Anne Sheffield.
Okay, Anne, did you still have a question, or did we answer it for you?
Yeah, no, well, if you answered it, I wasn't paying attention, so I'll ask again. A lot of us are trying to get rid of our lawns or minimize them, and I'm wondering if there is a low growing perennial that is good for like turf replacement, so you can still walk out there. I have violets, and I don't know what you would recommend for people who want a low growing native perennial in their lawn, mix them with their lawn.
Great
Clover.
question. Yep, great question, Anne. So there are a couple of things. If you, so the plants you mentioned that naturally sow themselves into our lawn are great. There are also native grasses that are not, I mean, they won't give you the golf course look, but for example, purple lovegrass, the foliage only grows about 6 inches tall. So it's a fairly low growing grass. And I know people who have essentially replaced lawn with purple lovegrass as just to make a native lawn. And you can interplant that with any of the low growing perennials like Penstemon hirsutus or Monarda punctata, Allium cernuum, you know, depending on what height the Bradbury's Monarda, depending on what height you're willing to tolerate and also just how much foot traffic you need. Or you could put almost like a pathway of maybe paving stones and then just plant these plants around it if you need to have a walking path through the area.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Let's see, Coarse, Pennsylvania.
Yes, the sedges
What is that?
Yes, so sedges are great grass replacements for moisture or shadier areas. We don't happen, they are a little harder to, some of them are a little harder to start from seed, such as Carex pennsylvanica in my experience. So you might be better off purchasing a plug tray of those, you know, that'll be a quicker way to get an area established. But the sedges are also great lawn replacements. Okay, Russ.
Hi, can you hear me?
You.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, so I am not very organized about storing the seed that I am not stratifying. So the stuff that's dry, you know, I collect it, make sure it's very dry, but then sometimes I store it in a paper bag at room temperature. Sometimes I store it in a plastic bag in the fridge. And I have a feeling that one version is better than the other, but I just don't know. Do you know?
Sorry, Russ, I don't know. And I've done the same as you. I can say that as long as they have been, you know, so the ideal storage for a seed is with a fairly low moisture content, but as Maggie said, not desiccated. So if you store them in a cool, dry place in the paper bag, like in your, I don't know, basement or maybe even garage or something, as long as the garage doesn't get too hot in the summer. The seeds, if you think about how they persist in the seed bank, some seeds can persist for literally decades, and they're actually undergoing cycles of drying and, you know, getting rained on, et cetera. But, you know, I would say a high percentage, I have been surprised at how long they last. So no guarantees, and we still like to, we sell the relatively newer seeds that are only, collected in the past year or two. But I would say there's a good chance they're still good. In the fridge, I've had seeds for a few years, and as long as they look like they haven't gone moldy or anything, they're probably just fine.
Okay, but the seeds you're storing in the fridge, are they in paper bags or plastic bags?
Plastic. I think actually the fridge, in my mind, tends to get moister if you have lots of fruits and vegetables in your fridge, like I do. So they're actually stored in, I put them, if I have a paper, like a seed envelope, a paper seed envelope, I put that in a plastic Ziploc. So it's actually sealed up in the fridge. But I have planted 4- and 5-year-old seeds, and they seem pretty viable. It's nothing scientific, Russ. So I've not done a true quantitative experiment, but I would say those seeds are generally still good. I mean, and it's probably not going to be true for every species. There will be differences, but the majority of native seeds, I've had pretty good luck with storing them for quite a while. I think Maggie could probably talk to, or perhaps in your own experience, some of the nut-bearing species. Those are, I think, the trickier seeds to preserve for long periods. Or nut-bearing species. Okay. Let's see. Anne, did you have another question? I see your hand is still up. Anne Sheffield?
I can't put the hand down. I keep touching.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
I touched it.
I just
too many
wanted to
times.
make sure you
Sorry.
didn't have.
Yeah, thank you so much. My main thing is my lawn.
Okay,
I
actually,
got rid of half of it, but
yeah,
it's
good
a
for
pollinator
you.
garden.
I did
Yeah.
see a question in the chat. You said common milkweed is a pink flowered. So Asclepias syriaca is a pinkish flower. Swamp milkweed, in the nursery, there are white varieties that are sold. And actually that is one species, just because it's so popular, that there is some data showing that the pollinators do find the white species very attractive. I have to say, white mutations in native plants are not totally uncommon. They do occur in nature, and the plants are still good larval hosts by and large, because it's not affecting their leaves. It's only the flower color. So
Thank you.
feel free to.
I have 3 colors of milkweed, and I got 2 cats on the backyard ones, which I think were both pink and white, but not anything on the orange ones in the front, which were supposed to be the butterfly weed.
Well, it sounds like those are 2 different species. And
Yeah.
And I guess in my experience, it varies on the year. So the reason that the monarchs use the milkweeds is because they contain certain chemicals, obviously, that make the caterpillars toxic. And Fata may want to chime in, but from year to year, and even as the plants grow, the concentration of chemicals in the leaves will vary. And the monarchs are just, they can sense when there is the right amount that will support their caterpillars to some extent. So they may prefer one species or another, but it kind of depends on the year. So some years I have lots of cats on the orange flowered milkweeds, the butterfly weed, and other years they do seem to prefer the swamp milkweed. So
they're so smart.
So it's hard to predict.
Okay, thank you, because I was trying to give variety.
Yeah, and that's another argument for why we do recommend. That's the beauty of the biodiversity. We are not smart enough to know, and by putting out a buffet of many choices, I think is the best way. And that's why using using a diversity of native species and using seed grown plants, which still have genetic diversity, is your best sort of insurance policy against different growing conditions, for climate resilience. It's us trying to give nature the best chance to adapt. Whereas if you grow the cultivars, they have no genetic diversity, they can't adapt.
I have a tricky question, because I know lady slippers are protected, but are there ever lady slipper seeds available? Because they're so amazing.
It's really difficult to, so lady slippers are a type of orchid, and an orchid are largely parasitic plants. So
Okay.
the seeds are so tiny, so they rely entirely on mycorrhiza associates to be able to germinate. So you have to have that symbiosis. So it's tricky.
Okay.
For a couple of the species, techniques I think have been developed to propagate them. It's certainly not for the faint of heart, but you can occasionally find them. I think Native Plant Trust does sell a couple species of our native lady slippers,
Okay.
but not from
Native,
right.
native plant trust, did you say?
Yes. Yes. So
That's on my bucket list before I die.
yes, I'm going to actually, I will go to screen share briefly, and actually in a follow-up email, we will send you a list of some sources of native seeds and plants. Native Plant Trust doesn't sell seeds, but they collect their own seeds, and they start most of the plants that they sell are from their seeds. So this is just to remind you that next Saturday,
great.
we won't have any lady slippers, but we will have about 50 or more species of these relatively easy to grow native perennials for sale. We're focusing on the native perennials, which are easier to start from seed. Maybe as time goes on, we will also have some programs to help us all learn how to grow the woody plants from seed as well. And hopefully we will also be able to sell woody natives in the fall. We'll have a plant sale then. But here are some sources of some commercial sources for native seeds for the Northeast. I would just say for our sale, the majority of the seeds are those that were collected by our Wild Ones members. So there's really no guarantees. We're selling them at a low price because, as Maggie mentioned, we do our best to find ripe seeds, ones that look healthy and like they will develop and germinate, but we can't really offer you guarantees because we're not a commercial organization that can really do germination testing and all that kind of stuff. But from our experience, we have been able to propagate from the seeds we've collected ourselves. So we think that these seeds should grow for you as well. But if you'd like to buy seeds, and especially if you're interested in seeds we don't have, here are some other sources. So Wild Seed Project, as you were introduced to through the video, they're based in southeastern coastal Maine, which is really part of our ecoregion. Eco59.com, which is part of CT NOFA's Ecotype project. They are ramping up and getting to the point where they're selling seeds as well as, or their collective is able to sell seeds as well as plants. And there's some Toad Shade Wildflower Farm is in New Jersey, and we will have a speaker, Randy Echoes from Toad Shade, at next month for our monthly program. But they sell seeds as well as plants, native seeds as well as plants. And there are a couple of new, and to mention Blue Stem Natives, I don't think they have any more seeds this season. They're up in Massachusetts, and I think they just got going last year. I just mention it because I think, there is a growing interest in natives, and there are so few sources that it's really a case where the demand over the past couple of years has really exceeded the supply. So I think you will see more small local operations starting to sell seeds. And we would be interested in finding out if any of you learn of these. We would like to collect this information and, as a service to our members, try to compile it and curate it as best as we can. Then there are some growers outside our region where they grow species that are native to the Northeast. And I think many of us have used them, as I say, because there are very limited native sources. So Prairie Moon Nursery has been mentioned. There is also Prairie Nursery. They mostly sell plants, but do sell some seeds, mainly in mixes. So I think they're catering more toward restoration work. Or people who have more naturalized areas that they're willing to try direct sowing. You don't really sow mixes into pots. You do sow them directly onto a prepared site. That can be a little more challenging. Similarly for Ernst Conservation, they are really a bulk seller. They sell seed by the pound, not by the packet. Roundstone Seed does have apparently a network of growers in different ecoregions, and they sell from the packet to the pound in terms of quantities. So these are some sources that our members have had good experience with. And we will send you in a follow-up email the names of these, and you can either Google the names, or I'll send links to their websites as well.